So today I'm giving a workshop on design considerations for the metaverse. Ryan had already mentioned earlier in his workshop what the metaverse could be and kind of expanding on that idea. I'm going to try to, have a particular definition that will work off for this talk just for the sake of, discussion. The metaverse, a lot of people, when they hear that term, in part, I think because of the company named Meta out there and things like that the metaverse is just XR experiences. I want to say that the metaverse, we shouldn't make it synonymous with AR, VR experiences. Like, it can be more than that. And I want to encourage an open mind towards what it could be and not, create that sort of limitation that it has to be like a full deep dive VR experience. The metaverse, as we're going to go off in this particular workshop, we're thinking of it as a network of interconnected virtual worlds. So it's not one particular experience. It's a network of various different worlds that you could go into, and possibly not even like a separated world. It could even be the world that we're in right now, just augmented. But of course, XR experiences, AR, VR, MR, whatever it might be, those we can consider an immersive version of the metaverse. That is the cultural kind of pinnacle of what people think the metaverse is going to be from pop culture references. It's just one type of experience that we can have, and it just happens to be immersive through a headset. For example, like Horizon Worlds is a single app on one specific headset. So if we're just saying that, it's only this app or that app, and you're just closing off the idea of what it could be to a specific device, like a head-mounted display or a specific application or a company of applications. We can also consider online games that we already have as kind of non-immersive versions of the metaverse or worlds within this metaverse. So like Fortnite, Roblox, whatever other popular MMORPG type of games that we already have through like a computer. Even though it's a 2D interface, it's still a virtual world of its own. So we don't want to limit that and say that that can't be part of the metaverse because it's not VR, because I also think it's a great starting point of entry for people who don't have maybe some of the more expensive hardware, like VR headsets or even AR headsets, which are significantly more expensive, at least in this time. So it's a good opportunity for people to kind of join in and support this concept of the metaverse, so we can move between worlds without having to be forced to be inside a headset, because some people may not even want that experience. Another consideration that we need to think about for the metaverse as well is kind of what is going to be transferred between these different types of worlds that we have. And that's where things like crypto and NFTs come in. So we have our decentralized assets that we can move between these different worlds. There's a lot of technologies available that or even not available yet that are going to be making this happen. So I want to focus here on just kind of what's unique to the metaverse rather than specifically in VR experiences or crypto or anything, one particular thing, because there's a lot that we already know about in, gaming, UX that we can apply to this. But, the more interesting thing I think is trying to understand what makes the metaverse as a concept unique and how we can design for that specifically. So it all starts with you as the person that's going to be in the experience, right? So in this case, we're usually talking about an avatar that's a digital representation of who you are, not just how you look in terms of, your skin color, your hairstyle, things like that, but also things that you bring along with you in your experience. You're also going to be collecting things from in-game events. Maybe you get a special occasion, you get a little party hat, something you want to bring into you in another experience. Just in addition to these aesthetic considerations of these objects that you start collecting in these virtual worlds, they may also have functional properties as well. So for example, like a wizard hat or a staff, where you can actually have functional properties, like you can cast a spell. So there's a functional capability as well that you might want to have transferred over to real worlds. And then as you complete these quests as a mage in these games, maybe you earn some money. Once you have all these different types of assets that have these different functions, what happens to them? Like, can you bring them to other places? Like, do you just spend hundreds of hours in this one game, and then once it starts becoming a little less popular, you just give up and don't have your assets anymore? So I think people would like the opportunity to kind of move between worlds. If you collect all these valuable assets that you spent, your time collecting, maybe even spent money if you invested to buy certain things like pets or any other helpful things, like you'd love to be able to transfer that between different worlds, right? So this is kind of where we're talking about things like creating standards for rendering transferable assets. So you have this wizard hat, right? And maybe you want to go into this like 2D retro pixelated game, or you want to go into an even higher fidelity like AAA game studio game. Like, what does it look like if they do transfer? Like, how will that be rendered? Like, we can start with things like having a design standard for how it's rendered, what type of metadata is going to be encapsulated in that particular object, so that we know, when it goes into another experience, you have this list of things that have to be rendered, and some of those functional properties I talked about as well. We can also ask questions like, which assets can be transferred? Like, is there a value to having certain things that can't be transferred between games? But also, who gets to decide that, why, and like, what are the implications of that?
So I think one of the things about, metaverse designs that's unique is when you're in Minecraft or you're in Fortnite, those have two distinct styles, right? They're both cartoonish, but Minecraft is very blocky, and Fortnite is like very stylized, but obviously much higher fidelity. And if we are now allowing for assets and value to transfer between worlds, you can't just have a square blocky thing in Fortnite, right, from Minecraft, because that just doesn't feel like the native expressiveness and like the native aesthetic of this virtual world. And if you go from if you have a skin from Fortnite and you go into a photoreal, Microsoft work world, it's gonna look kind of weird if it's not in the native style. And so I think the standards for design are gonna be at like the metaverse level, at the virtual world level, and also the avatar level. Like, a user should be able to decide, what does something look like? Then the virtual world will be like, hey, but this is our aesthetic. So if you come into this world, this is what we want the aesthetic to be. And then on a metaverse level, we have to agree on, hey, this thing can be transferred from all these different worlds, that one cannot. And so I think, what you're saying, like with the example of the hat, like there's all these different varieties. And as designers of assets, how do we create for like that adaptability and the flexibility that people now are hopping to different worlds? It's not just for one world. I think that's tricky, but like an incredible opportunity for designers.
Wanted to kind of just follow that up with, once again, another little anecdote. So grew up playing Counter-Strike, amazing game. Shout out to my CSGO players out there. The skin market is insane. And, like I said, I was showing you guys earlier, there's knives that go, $3,200 regularly and have been for some time. And so part of that world is that exclusivity, right? There's this many out there, right? And so another implication we think about, for that game and that particular economy, how do we create a system that allows that exclusivity and that rareness of the item to be maintained? Or, if you can take your knife out and move it over to Minecraft, in my mind, it is going to be really tricky. And we're going to have some, I think, almost pioneers, if you will, that are going to try and make those bridges happen, whether it be like, for example, like CSGO teams up with Fortnite, and then we see what that intermarry looks like.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of companies or brands would probably want to be exclusive by nature because that's how they maintain their brand. And usually how it goes now is that they make deals with other companies, like Fortnite makes a deal with Ninja, and then they make a specific asset just for Ninja. And making different types of the same asset is a lot of work. It's similar for developers, like kind of LODs, which are level of details, where you have the same asset with different level of details. But this would be different assets with different styles of details, LOSs maybe. Level of styles. But I think that's hard to like the work necessary for that. But I think with the rising of AI, perhaps that can be automated, similar to level of details was not automated before, but now it is. Like Unreal automatically, I think it's Nanite, automatically makes the level of detail less quality as the poly goes further away from the camera. So I think AI or new tech would also help in making these assets.
And I had never actually thought about this before, like how do you translate, designs for different platforms? And I kind of imagine, plugins. I actually imagine, I started to realize like you will have plugins to, you bought this asset, but you want to change it into something else, some other part. I think it will be like a market also for developers and designers to create these plugins.
Okay, so now that we've talked about avatars and some of the assets that you might bring with you, we could say that you have your own presence in whatever this world is, whether it's a virtual reality world or some other type of metaverse world. But now, once we have you as a person in VR, we need something to interact with. So how are we interacting with different people and different information assets? For that, we can talk about a category kind of gestures. So I would say there's at least two different distinct things we can mean by gestures. One of them would be natural human gestures that we make with our body. For example, it could be, waving. We all know what that means. If we have different types of input in the metaverse, for example, like, yes, we can have full facial tracking, full body tracking in like a virtual reality type of experience. But there are other types of like gaming type experiences where you don't have that tracking, so you have to like press a button to generate a gesture. How do we manage that type of nonverbal communication between people in these different types of virtual experiences if they don't have the same access to various types of input devices? So, I mean, I think it's safe to say in VR, for example, right now we are moving towards kind of a standardized controller type. We have the trigger and grip buttons. In hand tracking in VR, we also have, this pinch gesture for ray casting. So it seems like we are already kind of converging onto a standard as well for that. But once we include this interoperability of the metaverse, what do those standards look like? I want to focus kind of on like, how do we ensure that these messages are being properly communicated to people, like whether it's across different cultures or even just across those different experiences. For example, there might be some people with disabilities who, if it's a motion tracked experience, they might not be able to actually make that expression. So, having alternative means of making those expressions is important. And of course, if you want to enable sign language in these experiences, then you have to have those precise movements. I just wanted to bring that up because, we're familiar with accessibility in general in the design world. But since we have this opportunity as pioneers of the metaverse, we can kind of decide what these standards are earlier on so that we can kind of build with that in mind. One important point about accessibility, too, is that even though there are people who need these features, which we should not discount at all, there are certain accessibility features that we can make that are just useful and helpful to people. Like, for example, seeing subtitles while you're watching TV in a loud environment. You don't have to have any sort of hearing loss to, benefit from something like that. So we shouldn't have these considerations of accessibility as like an afterthought, not just because, again, people need them and we need to consider them as well, but because it makes the experience better for everyone. So another sort of category of gestures that I want to talk about as well is, sort of the UI interactions that we have once we get into like a more 3D world as well. So we already are familiarized with sort of the mobile gestures that we have, whether it's like swiping, pinch to zoom. After, however long it's been since the iPhone came out, and we've had smartphones, we've kind of come to a standard of what these things should be. But would these gestures look different on different devices, whether it's a VR headset or using like a 2D experience? Like, some people might not care as much about UI specifically, but if it doesn't seem like a problem to you, you might remember back in the day before emojis were standardized. Someone might send a particular emoji on their device, it looks one way, but then when the person receives it, it looks completely different. And you're like, I have an example from like Samsung. I got this from Melinda Ozell, who's an amazing emotion science researcher. Samsung, they had this grimacing face that looked completely different. It had eyebrows, it was like kind of pursing its lips a little bit. You can very, very visually see that it's like it looks like a different expression. So there's one example, but before we had standards where all these different vendors for like phones would have to create their own style of emoji, we had a lot of misunderstandings in communication. So if we're having, this broader metaverse experience and maybe it's even in 3D, these automated gestures that if we standardize them, we can at least have clearer communication and make the experience smoother. We've kind of hit on through this talk some concepts of like openness and mobility already. So openness would refer to kind of how centralized an experience is, whether it's a complete walled garden, which I'd say most experiences really are now, versus like this fully decentralized type of world that we're envisioning where you can transfer anything to and from at will. We also have a concept of mobility, which in this context, I'm not talking about like literal locomotion. When it's metaverse specific mobility, we're talking about the ease of moving your presence between these different worlds. Another important consideration is persistence. For example, we had a separate conversation earlier here where Ryan was saying, what if someone had this raging party in this metaverse experience and they caused a house fire and they just burned down this whole village. If you have persistence, it's just gone, right? Persistence is the idea of, that the experience can remember the state of a user or the broader environment or different assets. And that kind of brings up some interesting questions should all experiences have this complete persistence? And when would respawning be appropriate or even desired? There might be instances where if you destroy something of your own property, it should stay destroyed as some sort of element in the game or the experience. But there might be other things where if someone tries to destroy your assets and they shouldn't, there might be mixed use cases for this persistence, right? I'm wondering, what are the implications for personal expression as far as persistence is concerned? Whether or not there is persistence, will that affect how people behave in these experiences? I think we see on the internet that people are more likely to say things that they wouldn't say in real life, or act in a way that they wouldn't with people around, if there are actually people around them. So, I think it begs the question of, will people act out more in a full virtual space? Do we need to protect against that? What is at stake if we do this? There might even be a consideration for censorship. If we start to develop full-on government systems, would respawning, how would respawning affect a protest, for example? What does it say for this sort of free expression, and who controls that? Those are the sort of things that we want to consider. So I just wanted to end by discussing some pop culture references of what people already are considering the metaverse to be. I feel maybe some people who aren't in our sort of industry of technology, they might not have thought about it too much themselves, perhaps, and they might just see these different things like Ready Player One or an anime like Sword Art Online and think, okay, this is definitely what the metaverse is going to be. One thing I would caution against is taking any of these particular sci-fi pop culture references as something that's inevitable. So, even if someone wrote some story where they say that the metaverse is going to be a place where, like in Ready Player One, the world outside is a dystopia, and so it's actually preferable to just live inside a VR world, I don't think it's productive for us to say that that's the only opportunity that we have for what a metaverse can be. It might be more accurate, perhaps, to say that there's, this is just one of many possibilities, like a multiverse of metaverses, so to speak. Especially because these particular sci-fi adaptations of kind of living in a metaverse have these specific assumptions. So, for example, are people going to want to stay in VR for extended periods of time? There's also, of course, a question of yes, these sci-fi things can have a sort of almost magical element to them because we don't know what the technology looks like yet. So, is it even reasonable for us to think that's going to happen in the near term? Maybe, maybe not. I've seen some interesting things being developed on Kickstarter and stuff like that, where there is sort of a Nerve Gear style headset. Even if we can create that technology, does that mean people are actually going to want to use it? And so is there a way that we can create different unique value propositions for extended experiences or transient type of experiences that you can have day to day, like in an AR type of metaverse, where you don't have to fully dive into the experience, but you can just casually experience it. Sam was mentioning earlier about we can almost think that we're already in the metaverse already, where we are already using our internet and our phones. I like to think when I'm on my phone, my consciousness is almost sometimes in that world without actually being there. So it's a cognitive aspect of being in the metaverse. There might be one iteration where it's not really going into different worlds at all, but just making these transitions between different information just easier. So instead of having to access different devices, like pick up your phone, go on your computer, use a camera, that they'll somehow be more integrated and effortless. that could be one example. You don't want to also have this sort of dystopia, like, for example, there's a video online called Hyper Reality where you kind of walk through the streets and there's all this AR stuff just everywhere and your vision just popping up in front of you, being bombarded. So, I don't think people necessarily want that experience either. So it also gives us implications of, how do we regulate these sort of experiences so they're not disruptive? We already have an issue kind of in social media right now where there's so much focus on monetization and this sort of addictive quality to these platforms just for the sake of making money, but it's all at the expense of people's mental health, especially for the younger people. So I think it's important for us to consider from the beginning that if we're going to go into these immersive metaverse worlds that are so open and vast, that, how do we responsibly create these monetization pathways that don't create these dark UX patterns? Because I think it's very easy to imagine how it could become, dark and dystopian in that way. There is really a lot of possibility that doesn't have to be dystopian. So I don't think we should focus on preventing that as like, oh yeah, it's definitely going to be something horrible. We should avoid that. We have the opportunity to design for a future that we want to live in, and whether that's virtual or not. So let's just build a better future together.
To recap a little bit, like the unique design considerations that I heard from your talk are, we have to think about not just moving within a virtual world, but also across, right? That's one thing. I also heard that, now that you have all these different experiences that may be games or may not be games, what is the common or standardized like input mechanism across devices, right? Whether it's like a VR headset, an AR headset, spatial audio, like what is the muscle memory of the metaverse? And as designers, I'm not really a designer, but I think as designers of this new paradigm, when do we need to start standardizing? How do we come up with a standard? Like the emoji example was great.
But also like in terms of accessibility and design, all these things, I feel like it is a language, like the way that we communicate with gestures and with our body and all that stuff. And so language tends to mimic authority in a way. So I think that I actually imagine things kind of evolving more like in a biological way. Like whatever replicates fastest tends to become the norm. So I'm curious about how these authorities or these leaderships are going to come about, where people start replicating what someone did, like because they're like, this works.
Going off of you, I think it'll develop naturally over time, like most things do. Like languages develop over time and they adapt depending on where you are. Like it might depend on what game you're in. I don't think it'll ever be completely uniform. There will always be specific emotes for specific instances. But I just think it'll be like a hype thing. So like one person starts doing it, another person sees it, copies it, and then it's kind of widespreads it, like TikTok trends.
I think about emojis, kind of like that example you showed. I do feel like the reason people started emojis is because via keyboards, right? People are typing in semicolons and then parentheses, and then from there we had pictures and little like animated GIFs or GIFs, whatever. Then from there we had standardizations of the emojis. So I do feel like standardization comes from innovation within limitations, such as the keyboard. But even the keyboard, I mean, the QWERTY keyboard was not the original, and that became a standard eventually.
Yeah, you start off with a good foundation that people can build off and, be creative with, and then we can come to even new standards from there. Just starting with the baseline, like, all right, we should all kind of try to agree on these certain things, and then, as time goes on, we can always evolve the standards. But if we at least have these sort of standards, then we have a jumping off point.